Okay, so this is the beginning of Unit A. We will look at what biodiversity is. And if you look at biodiversity, if you just break the term down, which is a strategy you can always use, bio means living, and diversity just means differences. So biodiversity is just a variety of life that's found all over Earth. You can pause the video to look at these key concepts. You can pause the video to look at your learning outcomes. So if you just think about the world, there are a wide variety of environments and environmental conditions that exist all over Earth. You can go from the frigid cold of the poles to the steamy hot of the tropics. So it's different environments exist all over the world, and there are some dramatic differences between these environments. Of course, these differences of environments will give way to different species that would be able to live, survive, and adapt in those environments. So no single organism can survive in all of Earth's regions. Unfortunately, globally, the rate of extinction is on the rise. That things are going more towards less diversity. If organisms are going towards extinction, then you're having less and less diversity. Um, so the genetic material is decreasing. So in the past, it was usually the natural forces that have caused most extinctions, have provided a lot of stress to living organisms. And now, uh, more and more, we are increasingly having influences on the environment. So extinctions are also contributed by our activity. So this stuff is very important to study. So what is a species? This is something that we've talked about in class, and it's important for you to understand what a species is. So basically a species is a set of organisms, okay, that have similarities, right? There are differences and variations between members of the same species. So for example, you have, let's say you have a pit bull and you have a German Shepherd. Those are dogs. Those belong to the same species, Canis familiaris. However, they do have variations. Okay, so um, members of the same species have the same structure, but they can reproduce with each other. And the important thing is that they reproduce to form offspring, which can then reproduce themselves. Okay? So that's the important thing to understand with species. Okay? Biological diversity, as I said at the beginning, refers to all the different types of organisms on the Earth. Scientists don't usually examine the entire Earth's biological diversity at once because it's just way too difficult. And so what they do is they break things down into three general types of diversity, which is highlighted for you here in red, and indicates the importance that you do need to know this and be aware of the three levels of diversity. There's ecological diversity, which just has to do with the diversity of the different kinds of environments that you're going to find on the Earth. The second one is species diversity. So this just has to do with in between different species. You're going to have a lot of diversity. So for example, you could have a species of cats, okay? And you can have a species of dogs. That just shows you the species diversities because you have different populations. Genetic diversity now goes down to a more specific level with respect to individuals of the same species, of the same population that have differences. So for example, human beings, okay? And if you just go ahead and take a good look around our classroom, you'll see that there's a lot of genetic diversity. Diversity between ecosystems. In an ecosystem, living or biotic things interact with other living and non-living abiotic things in an environment. So an ecosystem is pretty complicated because you have living and non-living things that interact with each other. Okay? So some biotic and abiotic living things at St. Mark include what? You guys can go ahead, pause the video, and think of some things that are both biotic and abiotic at St. Mark. So it's good to review what abiotic factors are. This is a review of grade 7 science. So abiotic factors are factors in an ecosystem that are non-living. The sky, okay, water vapor, the sun, water, rocks. These are non-living factors in an ecosystem. Biotic factors, okay, so those things that were aforementioned before in the previous slide are all examples of abiotic factors that you would also see at our school. Um, things that you would see that are living factors, so biotic means living factors, so things that are alive. You would see us. You would see, you know, you would see teachers. You would see Mr. Martyr. You would see myself. You would see Mr. Berube, Mr. Gully. We are all alive, right? We are biological organisms, and students as well. Your classmates. There are plants in the school, and yes, there are mice in the school. And if you just go outside and you see a dog and cat running around, those are all examples of biotic factors that you would find at St. Mark's. So together, taking the living and non-living together, you have interactions and ecosystem. If you just think of the variety of species that you would find in plants and animals and combine that with so many other abiotic factors, you can just imagine the total possible number of combinations you could have that would result in a unique ecosystem. So you can appreciate the fact that there is a wide variety of ecosystems the world over. So the number and types of species and abiotic elements can vary from ecosystem to ecosystem, and that in fact it does. So here's an example of two ecosystems that show variety, that show diversity. Here we have a boreal forest, and then we have a prairie ecosystem, which are different and that will therefore support different interactions, different organisms as well. So now, instead of comparing diversity between ecosystems, we're going to go ahead and compare diversity within an ecosystem. We're going to look at the diversity of species. So the thing about a species is that they make up a certain population, and different populations of different species are reproductively isolated from one another. That just means that members of one population of species cannot reproduce with another member of a different population of a different species, okay? So for example, all this means is that if you have one population, we'll call it population A, and that's going to be a population of dogs, okay? Dogs. And then you have another population where there's, let's say, cats, right? That's a different population. We'll call that population B. Oh boy, I'm having a hard time writing with my mouse. So here's the thing. Dogs do not reproduce with cats. They're separate populations, okay? They can live in the same area, population A and population B, but they cannot reproduce. And if you have different species living in the same area, that's called a community. So here's an example of one population. You have a population of zebra that are reproductively isolated from other populations. So zebras can have baby zebras, okay, whatever they're called. But once you get something like this, then you have a community. You have many more organisms, many more populations in there. You have gazelles, you have zebras, and the zebras cannot reproduce with the gazelles. So they're separate populations, reproductively isolated from one another. They are community. This is a community. Now we'll go diversity within the species, and all that is that you're going to find differences between individual members of the same species. And all you have to do is just remember, for example, human beings. Okay, some of us are short, some of us are taller. That's an example of variation. Magpies is a very good example too. If you look at this picture, you can see a diversity of the species. Some have longer wingspans than others, some have different color patterns. Genetic diversity is the same thing. Genetic diversity is diversity within the individuals of a species. Okay, so genetic diversity is required to ensure survival of the species. Imagine if the color of the background in this picture changed. Let's say it was changed to a dark brown. That would mean that every snail that was not colored dark brown would stand out and be an easy target for predators. If all the snails were yellow or pale, then the species of snail would go extinct. But because some are dark brown, they are camouflaged against the brown background, so they can survive and therefore reproduce and ensure the survival of the entire species of snails. That is a very important topic coming in later slides called natural selection. So just to give you a hint, this is actually a um, pretty important idea for you to understand. Okay, so variations are pretty easy to see among individuals of a population, but some of them are not visible, and an example of that would be blood type. Species on Earth, this is important to know, hint hint, wink wink, nudge nudge, are not distributed evenly. Okay, as you go away from the North and South Pole towards the equator, you're going to have increasing diversity of species, simply because the environment supports different diversity of species. Okay, so here's an example showing that as you go from the poles right down to the equator, okay, from here up to here, right, towards the equator over here, more or less, you're going to have a wide variety of organisms as indicated by these numbers here that show you the number of species. Okay, so as you go towards the equator, you're going to have more and more diverse species. You have to know that. So, where do you think the lowest biological diversity is going to be? If you have the most diversity uh, on the equator, you're going to find the least diversity in the north and south poles. And why is that? Okay, so classification, you can go ahead and read this slide. Carl Linnaeus, he first started classification. He used Latin because Latin's a language that really doesn't change, and it's common between countries at the time that he started, and it just ensures that there's a common communication between scientists between countries. Okay, so common scientific language, the two major ones are the genus and the species. So, for example, we are the species Homo sapiens. We belong to the genus Homo, okay, and that's capitalized H-O-M-O. Separate word then becomes the species. Our species is sapiens. Okay, so here are some more examples of genus and species names for the red wolf, the timber wolf, and the dog we all know and love. Okay, so here is the classification system that's currently used right here. Okay, so generally speaking, what it is kingdoms are a very broad category, so you're going to find lots of variation there. Species is very narrow, so not a lot of variation there. In fact, that's the individual. Um, a good acronym that you can use to memorize the classification is King Paul cried out for good soup. Right? That's something that you can use to help you kind of remember the criteria. That acronym I just said doesn't really have the subphyla, but you could come up with something there. But King Paul cried out for good soup. Oh, here's another one. King Philip swiftly cut open 5 green snakes. So there are 6 kingdoms. So remember, kingdom is the very first classification. There's the Monera, which has been divided to Archaebacteria and Eubacteria, and as we discussed that in class, those are just kingdoms of bacteria. Biological diversity under the sea. There's a lot of diversity under the sea. So large coral reefs like the Great Barrier Reef can contain hundreds of species of coral and thousands of species of mollusks. Many fish, bird, and whale species are also associated with this ecosystem. Okay, talk to you soon. Hopefully that was helpful.